Welcome to another podcast from Finance Connect on the European asset finance industry. I'm Richard O'Donoghue, and today we're going to explore a topic that's critical to our industry, but which we rarely discuss: the supply chain. Our guest today is Alan Day, who's the founder and CEO of Flux, a global consultancy that specialises in building relationships between suppliers and their customers. Thanks to the miracle of technology, and with the kind sponsorship of Alpha, Alan joins us today from New Zealand. Alan, lovely to connect again, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to join you and catch up again.
Indeed. I mean, I was just thinking it's been a very long time. I won't say how long since we first met, but I was at Cisco, so people can work that out for themselves. And I guess when I first met you, you were delivering a training program at Cisco called Inside the Buyer's Head. And it was really teaching salespeople how to navigate a procurement cycle and how to work with procurement officers. Is that still part of...
It is, Richard. Yeah, it is. And that was fun. That was such a fun program at Cisco, which we rolled out globally. As I said, it's fun, but two, a lot of sales organizations actually do their best to avoid procurement, which in today's world is becoming increasingly difficult. So what we try and do is teach them that actually procurement has a process, and if you engage them at the right time using the right levers, then you can influence that program quite a bit, or that process quite a bit. So that's the program. It's to give them insight into what the buyer is doing, where they are in the process. There is a very formal process and the tools and techniques to influence that. And I was a bit lucky because I'd actually written the buying process at my time at Accenture. I ran the European Centre of Excellence for Procurement Supply Chain and wrote that strat sourcing process that a lot of organizations today now follow. So I had a bit of a unique insight into, well, using it for good, of course, but what insights can you use to influence that process positively for a sales outcome as well?
So that sounds, Alan, a bit like gamekeeper turned poacher, albeit you did say you did it for the good. But I think many people, certainly people who have not worked with procurement extensively, there is a nervousness about it. And I guess what State of Flux was doing at that time was trying to explain, as you said, that there's a process behind this and that if you engage appropriately, you can build relationships with procurement. It's not just all about cost.
Well, it's interesting, actually, because you're right. And a lot of that nervousness translates to avoidance. So people try and avoid procurement rather than engage them. But I think the biggest challenge is the timing of that engagement. So what we've seen is most people think procurement gets involved when there's a tender or something. But in fact, on a 7-step sourcing process, that tender or RFP or whatever engagement you've had is step 4 in the 7-step process. So there's 3 other steps earlier that are when the procurement person's shaping their thinking, getting their needs and their understanding together. Because the other insight is procurement aren't generally experts in what they buy. They're experts in the buying process,
right?
But not what they're buying. So in actual fact, they need to gather experts and gather insights. So getting involved earlier in that process means that you can influence what that expertise is going to the procurement person. So that was the insight that we were trying to give to Cisco, and others, HP, BT, NCR. Those programs have been a lot of fun. Funnily enough, I think we've come full circle in the, 20 odd years since we worked together. But yeah, where procurement's sort of back again, and people again have been trying to avoid them and now realize that they can't. So interestingly, we're seeing a renewed demand in that Inside the Buyer's Head program. So yeah, again, I have to say delivering it is a lot of fun too, because generally we're training procurement people on how to manage suppliers better. In this instance, it's fun to work with.
And that the topic we were going to touch on today, we kind of went into procurement a little bit, but we were really going to talk about supplier relationships. And, there's a lot going on in the world today with Strait of Hormuz. Is it open? Isn't it open? What's the impact going to be? We obviously saw during COVID this whole area of relationships and supplies again being very topical. Let's talk about it. I mean, give us your view, say, on the state of Hormuz. What do you think about it from a supplier perspective or supplier relationship management perspective?
Yeah, well, I should explain that when I left Accenture quite a long time ago, more than 22 years ago, I set up State of Flux to focus on supplier relationships because I'd worked out that the buying part of procurement was relatively well done. Happy to be challenged on that. But the supplier management was poorly done. And as part of State of Flux, we do annual research. Been doing it this is the 18th year of doing it. So we've got data on over 4,000 organizations. And let me tell you, only 6%, that's 06, not 16 or 60, 6% of organizations are any good at supplier management. So I just give you that context before going into the Strait of Hormuz, where it's kind of interesting because we're in that age where this is yet another crisis. So, and I was talking to a supply chain lecturer the other day, and they were using the term polycrisis. So all of a sudden, you're getting multiple crises hit supply chains. Your kind of disruption is the norm, and the Strait of Hormuz, the fact that it's open, it's not open, and the music stops and there's one chair less. That is becoming the norm. I was on a podcast where people were talking about the need for force majeure in that, and in actual fact, I would counter that and say that if you get to force majeure, that's a big indictment that your supplier relationship's no good. What we really need prior to, looking at the legals is, do we actually have good relationships? Will your supplier help you out during these times of challenge? Will they go the extra mile? So we look at and we use the term, are you a customer of choice for your key suppliers? And so the first thing I'd be saying is those critical or highly risky suppliers within your supply chain, are you a customer of choice for those? And most organizations are not measuring that to start with.
And if you go back to the 6% that you have, does the other 94% simply regard the suppliers as it's a vendor? I'm the customer here, and you're basically arguing they need to view that in a different way, where the supplier is a partner.
Yeah, absolutely. For most organizations, they cannot deliver their customer experience without their key suppliers. And I can back that up with some statistics. Over 50% of any organization's customer experience is actually provided by suppliers.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Okay, so let me put it in the context of a bank, just as an easy context. So if you walk into your branch and the branch is dirty because the cleaner, as a supplier, hasn't done their job, bad customer experience. You walk up to the teller's a temp. It's not an employee of the bank. It's an employee of a supplier. They're rude, bad customer experience. Your credit card probably comes from a third party, TSYS or some other third party, so not from the bank itself either. Your statement would be produced by another supplier. The call center could be another supplier. So if you map out your customer journey, most of the interactions are not with the company itself. It's with suppliers badged as the company performing a service or helping provide a product and so on. I use a bank as an example, but you can use almost any B2C example to see the impact. And when you overlay the supplier impact on that customer journey, you'll start to realize what a massive impact they have on delighting customers. And so we started measuring that as part of our research. We started measuring it. And, on average, it was sitting at the 50%. But you certainly get some organizations in the utilities, for example, where it's up in the late 80s and 90s. that the supplier does.
And is this then connected to the level of outsourcing that companies have done? I mean, is that what's really created
Absolutely.
this?
Yeah, it's completely connected to that. But equally not, it's also connected to the servicization of the world. You know, you don't buy ball bearings anymore. You buy a service from SKF, which has ball bearings in it and things like that. So yes, you've got outsourcing, you've got servicization, you've got more risk where you need more third parties to help you and so on. So more and more of that customer experience is provided by suppliers.
And so you've convinced me on the 50%, by the way, although does anybody go into a bank branch anymore? I'm not sure the
Well,
example.
yeah, apologies. I used that branch more as a just so that you could see it in your mind's eye, but you could use the same thing with, internet banking. It's the
Absolutely.
same. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Same.
Now, a quick word about our sponsors, Alpha. As we've heard today, it's easy to mistake day-to-day activity for true operational maturity, especially in a disruptive market. That's why having a true technology partner can make all the difference. This is where Alpha comes in. Its SaaS platform, Alpha Systems, provides end-to-end functionality for originations, servicing, and collections, helping asset finance providers modernize operations and prepare for what's next. Find out more at alphasystems.com. That's ALFA systems.com. What makes then for a good relationship with a supplier? How do the 6% that do it well, how do they do that?
Yeah, so to kind of answer your earlier question, a lot of organizations confuse activity with maturity. So just because they're meeting with their supplier, they think they're managing them well. But what we see is, it's almost like a hierarchy of needs where we need the infrastructure. So you need, like you would with your customers, you segment your suppliers to understand who's more critical, who's highly risky, who impacts the customer more, who impacts your revenue streams more, and so on. So segmenting your suppliers is kind of one piece, making sure you've got contracts, performance, all those basics in place.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest thing is actually what we're seeing is aligned with a governance structure, is actually defining roles and responsibilities, defining behaviors, and training people. So over the 18 years that we've been doing the research, ironically, we started with the training discussion, but actually people are not training uh, their organization on how to manage suppliers. And if you think about it, if you're managing employees, you get an HR department, you get support from well, you probably get trained, you get policies, procedures, you get guidebooks, but you could be managing just as many people or more via third parties. So you're managing a supplier. You don't get any help at all.
Mm.
Most people don't get trained on it. There isn't a handbook. It's not in your job description. Your boss doesn't help you for it. So all we're trying to do is highlight that this has a massive impact on your business, on your profitability, and it needs to be treated in a similar manner to how you would manage your own staff. And on that note, we've seen it's just over 50% of your workforce doesn't work for you. They're employed by your suppliers. So when you look at those two stats, it gets really
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You're quite right. You think about all the training employees are given, and I can never recall in any of the companies I've worked in any sort of training around managing supplier relationships. In many ways, I think suppliers are treated as a vendor, and they're lucky to have
Yeah.
business with us. Whereas you're kind of arguing the reverse, that if you treat your suppliers as a partner, they can help you when you have situations like the Strait of Hormuz.
We've got some stats on that. So we know that if you're managing your suppliers as a partner in a collaborative manner, over and above what you've contracted with them, we've seen on average between 2 and 6% additional benefit coming from the relationship. We've also seen that you're twice as likely to get what we call the A team from the supplier. You're twice as likely to get scarce resource, which plays completely to the Strait of Hormuz. You're twice as likely to get preferential pricing, 3 times as likely to get innovation first, and the big one for me, 5 times faster speed to market. So incredibly compelling if you're doing it properly. But as I said, most organizations are confusing activity with maturity, and they think just because they have performance metrics in place, or they have what we call a QBR, or a quarterly business review with their supplier, they think they're managing them in the right way. But what we're advocating is what we call joint account planning, where you've got your strategic suppliers, joint goals, joint targets, joint objectives, joint behaviors, even between you and the strategic suppliers. Can't do that with everyone, but you can certainly do it with those at the top of the tree.
So in the same way that you'd have that process with your customers, in many cases, joint account planning, you're basically saying go and look at your suppliers and do something similar.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the innovation and speed to market. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on how?
Yeah, well, what we've seen is most large organizations tend to dictate what they want to the suppliers. So you mentioned, it's the vendor type approach, or even worse, I've heard it called the master slave type relationship. Thou shalt. I did have a client that said, we don't have a bad bone in our body, but please watch out for our good intent. And part of it is just the size of some of these companies. They're asking suppliers that may be small to do something that in their mind is very easy to do, but for the supplier could be, not 10 minutes work, but 6 weeks work kind of thing. So that's a bit of an issue in terms of finding the right suppliers to work with to put these in place. And apologies.
And on the innovation side then and speed to market,
Sorry.
I mean, how does that work? Or can you give some examples where
Yeah,
it
so
helps?
apologies. What I was trying to get to was, for innovation, if you think about it, these buying organizations are dictating to the suppliers, but the suppliers are actually the expert in their niche, in their area. So what we should be doing in a perfect world is tapping into those expertise and letting them, help us shape and collaborate with us in terms of whatever that strategy is. And you don't do that by dictating to someone how they should run their business or what you want. With the annual research, we actually, a few years ago, we did a kind of special excerpt on the luxury brands, and one in particular who was a big client at the time was McLaren, and they do a fantastic job of working with their suppliers, not only to make them feel part of the McLaren family, but also to harness those good ideas that they need. And it's quite interesting. You get that because of the luxury piece, where volumes are tiny but very high quality requirements, etc. So McLaren would talk to you about creating supplier loyalty, and as would the other luxury brands like Bang & Olufsen and Ferrari and a few others that we spoke to, Sunseeker. But you never hear a big organization talking about how do we create supplier loyalty? How do we make sure that we are the people that they give that innovative idea to first? So for me, that's key. There are other aspects to it, like most organizations don't define what innovation is for their organization and then communicate it back to the suppliers. So you get this scenario where the supplier thinks they're giving them good ideas. The organization thinks that what they're getting from the supplier is a sales pitch. And then worse still, the supplier then doesn't get any feedback. And so they kind of go through the motions of, well, we're never going to give them another good idea again because it's just wasting our time. So you get this whole awful scenario where in actual fact the supplier is an expert. That's why they've been chosen, yet we're not harnessing their innovation through. So yeah, it's a huge untapped opportunity. And fastest speed to market goes exactly the same scenario, where the supplier just is able to give you insights, not only to what often the market's doing, but also if you've got the right relationship, they'll give you insight into what the competitors are doing as well. And so you're able to navigate the marketplace generally quicker with the team behind you. Again, we talk about the extended enterprise because, being a Kiwi, think of things in terms of rugby, and you can't. A person isn't going to win the game. It's a team sport, and for me, it's exactly the same with suppliers. You can't deliver your end product or service without the team of suppliers behind you.
It's a very interesting perspective about, treating them as a team member and utilizing them. And you've already sort of alluded to the fact that we don't give them feedback on many occasions and therefore they stop bringing ideas. Besides just not engaging, what tends to go wrong in supplier arrangements or relationships? What are the absolute no-goes that you see in the industry and think, how is somebody so stupid as to do that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you see everything, all scenarios. But what we tend to find is the things, the catalysts or the underlying reasons for that tend to be more around communication, trust building, and if I then look at some of those, it comes, so it's all behavioral aspects. It tends not to be, did you breach this clause? So everyone puts all this time and effort into the contract and getting the kind of hard metrics for KPIs sorted, and they put no effort into the behavioral aspects, which in reality, it's the behavioral aspects that are going to cause all the and generally we find when we're reviewing specific relationships, it's often fallen down because the customer organization, the buying organization, isn't doing what they say they would do. So they're not following up with their actions. It's not often the supplier. The supplier will get it wrong. The supplier will not achieve, but they don't turn up to do a bad job. Generally they do a bad job either because they're not given the right information, the environment's not right, or frankly, they're treated poorly, and you get the C team who just don't want to be there. So normally, if there's an issue, it's the buying organization that's been the problem. And I can say that after doing this for over 22 years, and having data on 4,000 organizations as well.
Gives you a good place to start when you're having this conversation.
I was just going to say, we talked about 50% of your customer experience is provided by suppliers, but I think it's 9% of organizations actually provide customer feedback to suppliers. So it's, so they're doing frontline jobs, but not getting any feedback.
It sounds like communication, as you said, behavioral aspects are really what drives a lot of this, and just, not having a methodology and a consistency in terms of delivering, feedback and regular communications, that's a big part of the problem.
Massively. But the challenge is, though, that you need the infrastructure to ensure that you get the right behaviors and the right structure. So, although behavior is critical to it, for me, you also need process, governance, policy, procedures, contracts, and you need technology to underpin it all. So all of those things are key to it, but where it falls down is always the behavior piece. You can define behavior, you can train behavior, but it doesn't sit in isolation. It needs to be part of a strategy, a process, an approach for it.
So as you know, this is a podcast aimed at, I would say, finance people. So one thing that I wanted to ask you about, it's not a technical finance question, so you should be fine with it, but it's really around payment terms. And you often see buyers essentially turning around and say to a supplier, I've got, pressures on my cash flow. Therefore, instead of paying you in 30 days, I'm going to pay you in 90 days. How does that sit with you and sit with suppliers? What's your perspective on behaviors like that?
Yeah, it's a good one. I got a bee in my bonnet about this, and I actually wrote a paper on the mathematics behind payment terms, and in actual fact, most buyers don't know the maths behind it. They've been told to extend payment terms, but, they're effectively just following a three-line whip. Whereas, if they use their brains, the collaboration would yield way more benefit than it would. And for me, I when I look at payment terms, I come back to that customer of choice piece. So we know through the research that to be a customer of choice for an organization, it's three things. It's money. So are they making a big profit, or are you a source of revenue for the supplier? It's brand alignment. So they want you your brand on their corporate CV, and it's behavior. And we've talked about behavior. When you break those down, the money part of it, generally a supplier is getting a regular payment, right? And it's a bit like your salary. You do a good job, you expect to get paid. So over time, it's not a motivator, but a hygiene factor, right? It's not why you turn up to work. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It becomes a hygiene factor. However, if someone messes around with your salary, it's a massive demotivator. Why is it any different for suppliers? Why do we think that we can treat suppliers like this? I mean, if you think about it, over half of our employees are going through suppliers, and yet we think it's okay to go from 30 to 90 days, and the supplier will live with that cash flow piece. So for me, I come back to that customer of choice piece, and also the maths tells you that if it's a regular payment, and you do move from 30 to 90 days, you actually only ever get one hit of benefit.
Mm.
It's still a regular payment. It just goes back into the drumbeat of monthly payments.
Yeah. So you possibly make a short-term benefit, but you
Yeah.
burn all of your relationship capital with that supplier.
Yeah. So for the finance team, there is a big opportunity here, because one, you can be smart about this, and you can still extend payment terms, but you can offer supplier different kind of credit packages, or factoring type approaches, so that you can benefit from that. There's a big opportunity for that, but my key thing is, why would you burn the relationship for a one-off hit? Most, look, we get hit with them as well. I've got one at the moment where the procurement person, ironically, just does not understand why 90 days is pretty abhorrent.
You need to send that paper you've written to them, and maybe then
I
they'll
certainly
understand.
do. In fact, yeah.
Listen, we often get people as well, younger listeners, who are starting out in their careers, and often we talk about asset finance as an industry that people sort of fell into and then stayed in it and built their careers. Is the whole supplier industry, procurement, supply, I'm going to bundle them together, is it similar that people kind of drift into it and then realize there's lots of strands to it, and they can therefore have rewarding careers? Or what should you do if you want to move into this area?
Yeah, absolutely. It has traditionally been a collection of ragtag individuals, but what we are seeing is the universities often now are offering supply chain courses. But see, my specialty has been the supplier relationship management, and that expands into kind of performance management, contract management, risk, innovation. Whereas, you could go the physical end of supply chain and look at things like logistics, trucks, sheds, all of that. So it's quite varied where you go to, or you could go into the procurement people that we've been talking about with Love, and spend your days traveling the world negotiating with suppliers, etc. So, it is quite varied. A lot of large organizations will have it as a stop on a graduate program. So that's one way. Another way is to try it with a university and look at what supply chain courses are there. I actually did a master's in decision sciences, and that was got me in through more kind of the manufacturing just in time type world. So yeah, it's quite varied, but it's fun. It's fun.
Yeah, and as you said, lots of variety to it. So it sounds like, Alan, you didn't just drift into it. You had intent, and you found a very rewarding and varied career. And then obviously you left the corporate world, set up your own company. Maybe talk a little bit about setting up your own company, why you did it, and what does State of Flux do today?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I suppose I had an entrepreneurial bent all the way through my career. Although I was working in corporates, I was starting small businesses on a regular basis. And I got to the point where I felt passionate about supplier management. I'd noticed that people could do the buying part through the strategic sourcing process, but they couldn't do the supplier management. And I sort of thought, well, maybe it's time to use my kind of entrepreneurial spirit and my passion around managing suppliers to kind of bring the two together. So that was the catalyst for it. When I set the company up, we started with training and consulting, and we still do focus on training and consulting, but over time we've added technology in there. So we actually provide some very large global corporations technology on how to manage their suppliers. So that's things like supplier relationships, supplier performance, contracts, risk, innovation through technology. So when I talked about process and technology being a key building blocks, these are things that we do with corporations to do it. And then what we do annually is we do an annual survey, which is why I've been able to quote these statistics. And we use the survey not only to help our clients understand what's leading practice and give them benchmarks, but we use it to shape our own products and services to make sure that we're supporting the market in the way they need to be supported. Where I'm seeing it going, though, is more and more organizations are now asking not just for consulting, training, or technology, but more of a managed service where we're working in partnership to actually help them run effectively like a center of excellence for supplier management, which is a lot of fun.
Fantastic. And I know that you make available the results of those surveys to people. They can go on your website. So we'll post the details in case any of our listeners are interested in understanding more and understanding statistics like 50% of your customer experience is determined by your suppliers and seeing how that's backed up. So I'm going to finish off. You know the world of podcasting. It's immensely competitive and cutthroat. And normally we don't endorse other people's podcasts on this show, but you do your own podcast. I know it's called Power of Three. So that's as good an endorsement as I'm going to give you. But one of the things I know you do in it is you ask people, 3 things that influence them. And you often focus on a book or a piece of music. So maybe we'll finish off by asking you, is there a book or a piece of music that has influenced your life or your career?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of books and well, music for me is quite a big one. But I was lucky enough to travel to New Orleans in the 90s and go to a supply chain conference where the guest speaker was a chap called Eli Goldratt. And I'd read a book of his called The Goal. And he also writes another one called The Race. And it was all about kind of just-in-time manufacturing or just-in-case manufacturing, which is probably very applicable today for the Strait of Hormuz and others. So, and I found that incredibly insightful in terms of looking at how factories work, and that for me was kind of the beginning of my career into the procurement space. Yeah, so that would be my book, The Goal, from Eli Goldratt. And music
sounds great. So if anybody wants to read music, go for it. Yeah, if you want to go with a music one, we could do 2. I'll let you have a second go.
Yeah, the music one. Well, so I'm gonna go very modern here. I'm currently listening to some AI music, which is quite
AI music. Okay.
Yeah, and it's an AI generated track called Tokyo Room by, I'll spell it, I think it's Laive Music, Laive Music. So I quite like it. It's a little bit funky, but there's a line in there that says, "Goodbye things, you fade into dust. I count my wealth in presence and trust." And I kind of thought that's quite cool, both in supplier management, but frankly, just with a person who's got 2 teenage children who, well, have spent a lot of time on devices. I thought that was quite a good one.
So, Alan, thanks so much for chatting about this today, a topic that I guess I have a degree of familiarity with, but certainly not to the extent that you've brought us through. So it's been a real pleasure. It's such a topical issue at the moment, and just learning more about it and the need to really form relationships with suppliers and treat them as a partner rather than just simply a supplier or vendor. How critical that is in a world that's constantly changing and as you said, where disruption is probably going to be the new norm. So thanks so much for joining us today and taking us through this.
Thanks, Richard. Complete pleasure and wonderful to catch up again as well.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Finance Connect. The supply chain and supplier relationships are something that we rarely consider in the asset finance industry. Yet, when you think about it, our business depends entirely on assets being delivered to our customers in a timely and consistent manner. Otherwise, we have nothing to finance. Over the past few years, we've seen an increasing number of supply chain disruptions, such as COVID, the ever-given blockage in the Suez Canal, and the current issues with the Strait of Hormuz. It seems likely that such disruptions are the new normal, and therefore being a customer of choice is key to ensuring continuity of supply when challenges arise. I also found the conversation on innovation to be particularly interesting. We all talk about the need for innovation in our businesses, and yet we rarely harness the expertise and insights that our suppliers have. If you've enjoyed this podcast, look out for future episodes on your preferred platform every few weeks. You can also find all of the past episodes on those platforms. Thanks as always to our sponsors Alpha, and keep sending us your suggestions for future guests and topics. In the meantime, thanks for listening.